All right. Hello, everybody. This can be found on testingreactboston.netlify.com. So I am Matt Crowder, as that says. You can find me everywhere at mcrowder65. I'm happily married, and we have a golden retriever. His name is Charlie. I am the organizer of Nova.js, which is where I am from. I'm from Northern Virginia. And so Northern Virginia stands for Nova. Oh, yeah, we got to, OK, cool. Some of the things I enjoy are lifting, running, and American football. OK, so the title of this talk, that's not the title of the talk. So the title of the talk, right, using React testing library to write stronger tests. So I want to talk about like my history of tests, like how I wrote tests, and talk about that and how I landed upon React testing library. So it was my first week of my new job, my first job in the industry, and what happened was my coworker turns to me and he's like, Matt, we have no idea how to write tests for React. And I said, OK, I'll figure out how to write tests in React. So I downloaded like Karma and Mocha and Chai and some other library, and I started testing React components. And I tested every single thing you could possibly test in React component. And so I think if you could have 110% coverage, I would have gotten it, because it was just so well covered, every single line, and it felt great because I had every single thing covered. And then it was also great because every single time I changed anything, it broke all of my tests. And that's like how I wrote tests. And so I would test functions, like anything, everything and anything would just get tested. So let's kind of dig into like the wrong way to write tests, like an example. So I wrote just like a little toggle component. So there's a React paradigm with like controlled and uncontrolled components. So basically you have the idea that if you don't provide like a handler to a component, it will automatically handle state itself internally. So I have this component called wrong, and if you see here, there's this controlled label, which is what we're seeing right here, and then uncontrolled. So we have this switch that uses a controlled checked and set checked. And those together, they toggle together because they're controlled. And when they're uncontrolled, I don't pass them toggled and untoggled, so they toggle independently of each other. So that's the whole idea. So past me and me this week, so I could get a good example, what I would do, well, let's actually look at the source code for a little bit. So it's just a basic React component, class component. We use state, and we say checked is false. We initialize it to that, and then we take in two props. We take in a checked prop and a toggle prop, and then in my input, I just say like, hey, checked is this.getChecked, and in there we check to see if they pass in a checked prop, and don't do like a truthy with a boolean, because like if it's true, then it'll freak out. So anyways, so to check, I say if it's not defined, then I'll use the props checked, and then the same thing with the toggle function. If the toggle is undefined, then I'll do the props toggle. And then if they're not, then I'll do the state. And so that's like controlled versus uncontrolled. So I'm like, OK, well, cool. So I have this getChecked function I need to check, or I need to test. So I would create a describe block that's like, all right, I'm going to do the getChecked. And I say, hey, when I pass a checked function, when I pass a checked prop, it's going to return that checked prop. So I would shallowly render this component, and I would pass in the checked prop, and then I would use an instance, and then I would call getChecked, and then assert that it was equal to the same one that I passed in. Okay, and then I'm like, great, this test is passing, I get some coverage, awesome. And then the next thing I would do is I would test the toggle method, because that's the other method that we have in the component. So we have this toggle, we say, if I already explained that, right? So if it's there, it uses it, otherwise it just returns local. So I say when passing toggle as a prop, it uses it. So I create toggle, it's just a simple jest function, pass it in, and then I call component.instance.toggle, and then I expect the toggle to have been called. And then I also say, hey, when toggle is not passed as a prop, it just sets checked in local state, and I literally look at local state, and I say, hey, like state, are you checked or are you not checked? OK, so that is how I used to write tests. And so what happened was, I just kept writing tests like that. My code just kept breaking, but it seemed OK. And so React testing library came out, and the whole concept of it was like, oh, you can't test like internal state or internal functions. And I was like, oh, well, then this sucks. I'm never going to use it. And then hooks came out, and I remember watching it and being like, wait, but then you can't test your internal functions. And I was like, no, I'm never going to use these things. These things are terrible. And so that was only for a day. And then I was finally like, well, wait, maybe this makes sense. Actually, no, I didn't ever think that. Kent C. Dodds sent out an email, and he basically wrote the test that we were just looking at, and he said, like, this is a terrible way to test your code. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, why? So then I was like, okay, I'm going to check out React Testing Library. So what is React Testing Library? So it's a solution for testing React components. It can and it should be used anywhere Enzyme is. So however, Enzyme, I believe, can be used with React Native. React Testing Library is only for web React. Like, there might be a way you can do it with React Native, but everything I'm talking about is just for React. There is a native testing library solution, which is comes along, that's like a sibling, I guess, of the React Testing Library, and it's for React Native, but I haven't really done anything with that. Okay, so what does React Testing Library encourage? So the funny thing about this switch test that I have is that I have 100% code coverage, but I never actually I never do anything with the render method. I just check everything around it, but it's 100%, right? So that's good, right? No, it's terrible. So the idea is that you want to render out your code, and then you want to test on the output, and you can simulate events through the DOM as if you are a user using it. And then the whole mantra of React Testing Library is the more your tests resemble the way your software is used, the more confidence they can give you. So that's the biggest take-home point. When you write your test, you need to be thinking of it if this test is how my user is using it, then this should be, I'm confident that this is a good test. Okay, so let's dig into some of the APIs. So here we have all of the different APIs. So basically, we have a get all, query all, find, and find all. So what all these mean? So for every single one of these bullets, get also corresponds to there's a get by label text, get by placeholder text, get by all text, and then same with get all, query all, and find all. So get, what it does is it looks in the DOM and it says, it looks for these things based on label text, and then if it's not there, then it throws. And then query, it looks for it on the DOM, and if it's not there, then it just returns null. And then find, it looks for it, it does the query, and then if it returns a promise, and if it's not there, it just looks for 4.5 seconds, and then you can change that if you want, and then if it doesn't find it, then it just rejects the promise. Okay, so those are your simple queries. So the reason why React Testing Library and why people like it so much is that it's very developer-friendly. It has so much tooling out of the box, it has really easy ways to look at your DOM, because if that's what you're encouraging to look at the DOM, well, you're in luck because there's so many queries that allow you to actually look at it. Okay, so, and then the other part, like I was saying, you want to simulate events. So we have fire events. So it provides an API called fire event, and basically any browser event can be simulated with fire event. So now let's get into actually testing a component using React Testing Library. So 3 things. So when you want to simulate events, test the output, like I was saying, and then when you're using class components, the only public function is just your render method. Well, why is that? Because your render method just renders out to the DOM. You don't care about get toggle or get checked. You just care about render. You don't care about anything else because your users don't care about that. They don't care if you're using local state or if you're using redux. They just care that it's displaying on your page properly. And then I'll get into wrapping a render when I get into the real world example. So like every talk that you will ever see, there's always this contrived example, and then you're like, how am I ever going to use this in reality? Because we always have these really terrible projects that are really hard, and then it's this is never going to apply. So I decided to stay with that and do that for you all. And then I'll do a real world example. So first, what I like to do on every single test is, actually let me start a little bit higher. So I refactored the switch component to use hooks internally. So it's pretty identical. The return is identical. It's just now I'm using hooks to set checked and get checked. And now you can't look at the class method, so that other test would just start failing. So I like to just do a check that it renders. And how I get render, it's imported from @testinglibrary/React. So Render is imported from testing library, and so is fire event. So all you do is check, okay, does it render? Okay, that's just like a base case. And then now we want to think about when we're writing this test, when we have that switch component, we have, let's go back to what it looks like. So we have two kind of users with this switch component. So we have developers are actually a user, if you think about it, because it's a controlled component, you have the ability to control it, and then also just users of your application are also a user of it. So when I write these two tests, I need to think, how am I going to represent my developers, and how am I also going to represent my users of an actual web application? So the first one, I'm not really going to care about my developers as much, because when it's uncontrolled, like you don't really, that's not like when your developers are using it. So what you can do, you know how I was mentioning these queries? So when you call render, it returns all of the queries. And then you can do it, and then it calls it on the DOM that like got rendered by switch. So then you can do get by label text, and you can look up checkbox. So if I look at my switch hook.component, if you see here, I have this ARIA label. You know, I actually didn't check if that was really accessible, but I added it, so. So what I will say is you can also add a data test ID, and you can do checkbox. And then instead right here, you can do get by test ID. What I have read is that if you're just putting test IDs everywhere, then then like there may be a more accessible way to do it, because this still works fine. But I actually didn't check to see if ARIA label was actually correctly placed right there. So, but anyways, so you can test like with accessibility to like assert that your components are accessible in a way. So we have this get by label text, and we can look at when I render it, I'm gonna assert that the checked is false. So checked, that's like the actual element. That's like the property of like the attribute of that component. We say, hey, it's false, and then we click it. So we can do fire event.click. And what I was saying about that you can fire any element, or fire event can simulate almost any event on the browser. So if you look here, here are all the events that it can fire. So it can do blur, abort, all these different things. So when you're like, you could test like tabbing and mousing through like all of your components using fire event. Okay, so since this is a lovely contrived example, I'm only clicking. So I get the checkbox, I click it, I assert that it's true because it's uncontrolled. It's just going to keep going back and forth. So here we go. Okay, so that case is only testing like our end users. Now we're going to write a test case that's for our developers. So I wrote my own component in my test case. Yeah, crazy, right? So I implemented the ability. I implemented the like checked and set checked in my test, and here, because I want to know like how it's going to work when I provide my own controls to it, so that I know that when my developers use it, one of my users, that this is how they're going to be using it. They're going to be creating like their own way of using this component. So I basically, it's almost exactly this. It's literally the exact same test, except I'm using this wrapper instead here. So there's a way to like you could create like a reusable way where like you do the assertions twice. But in my experience, once you start having not contrived examples and you have like hundreds of tests, it's a lot easier to just scope all of your tests, try to scope it as much as you can to just your test, because otherwise it gets really confusing when you have to like jump through all these files, figuring out like how things are getting tested and everything. Okay, so there's our contrived example. Okay, so now let's do a real world example. So the guy earlier said, oh, if you do a theme, you should store in React.context. So I stored my theme in Redux. But I want it to be as real as possible, because we have these legacy apps, and it's like, you can't just like migrate away from Redux. And so basically what I wanted to do is I have 4 different providers in this application. I have a React router provider, I have a Material UI provider, I have a Redux provider, and I have a React INTL provider. So then if you think about tests, so you have to render 4 different providers anytime you do any of the stuff that relies on those providers. Yes, you do have to do that. But one of the nice things is if you use a wrapper around your render method, then you can abstract your providers, and you abstract the render method, and you just pass in your component, and you just automatically render all the providers. So also one of the things that this example is doing is on page refreshes, it preserves the primary color. So we need to write a test that will like simulate how the user is actually using this. So let's look at that. Let's actually look at the code real quick. So I'm using React Color, I think, yeah, for the swatches. So I just have this formatted message that I have declared. And a translations file that will like show the stuff on the screen. So if you don't provide a provider saying, hey, this is a React INTL component or translation, then your component, like your test is going to freak out and be like, hey, where's this provider? And I also have this button right here that will update the theme color. And then the theme color is just stored in Redux. And when I click it, it just calls this map dispatch to props, update theme color, which is an action. And then we use that somewhere else in a reducer. And then I'm just updating the state. And then I'm just using like a set-in thing instead of like spreading 6 levels deep. Okay? So how do we want to test this? We want to test it as if we are a user of this component. So first, we render, because users like to just render our component and do nothing else with it, and just look at it. Second, so kind of list my cases here. So when updating to a new primary color, then the button changes to new primary color because this is a primary button. All right? Okay? And when re-rendering the component, the new primary color stays. So how can you do that with React Testing Library? React Testing Library provides a solution that, actually let me break this real quick. They provide a solution called unmount and re-render. So if you unmount, right, that like pulls your component off the DOM, and then if you re-render, then you're like putting it back on the DOM. So what we did, now let's look at that providers. What we did is we created that render method that like abstracts React Testing Library render. So I import it right here as RTL render, and that's just the React Testing Library render. And I take in my component, and then I create a store here, and I pass it into my providers. And then in my providers, this is just like running all my providers. Yeah, there's like not that much to that. And then in my app.js, so I don't like duplicate my providers, so I can use it in my base level app.js and then in my test cases too. Okay, so in my utils file, I just wrap my render method, the React Testing Library render. Okay, so what I want to do is I know I need to get the label text because the button has a label, and then the swatch picker, actually every single color in the swatch picker has a title on it, which is like the color. And so I need to get by title. And then I'm also going to pull off re-render because I know I want to simulate a page refresh as if like the user's using it. So first I want to unmount and then I want to re-render. So I created just a little helper called getButton. So then it'll just get me the button by the specific label text, which we update primary color. And then one of the cool things with this is we have a lot of good matchers. So in order to check the background color of the button, I can do toHaveStyle, and it will just be like, hey, I'm going to expect the style is this particular background color. So I check to see that the primary color is the main color, which is like what I actually set. So on page load, like that's what it is. So on page load, the user comes to this button and they're like, oh, it's going to be this color. Like that's what we care about, that it's like the right theme color. And then I have this new color, and I'm going to do another fire event. I'm going to click. I'm going to do get by title. So the get by title new color, right? So I know every single hex on the screen has a title, and those titles are all of these hex values. And so I click the hex, and then now I click the button, and so then I'm like, okay, I just changed what the primary color is. So now I'm going to assert that the button has the new style. Okay, and then now I need to simulate a page refresh by doing an unmount and then a re-render of my component. And then, so WebStorm's telling me here, so this is, if you can read that, the assertion failed. Why did the assertion fail? So I created a wrapper method around React Testing Library's render method, but I didn't create a wrapper around its re-render method. So if you think about that, when you re-render, you need to re-render with all the providers. Otherwise, it's just going to break. I don't even know if it would tell me, like, actually, there it is. Could not find store in the context of connect because I don't have that provider in there. And then that just happened to be the one that threw. So what you can do is if you go to your, right here, and you just delete 2, then it just gives you the re-render. So the re-render method, so when you also pull off, when you render, it pulls off a re-render method. So then all I did was I pulled off re-render, and then I defined it myself. And you can see it right here when I re-render. It's basically identical to the render method. I take in a component, and then, but except I'm creating a new persisted store. And in the persisted store, so I forgot to talk about this. So how I'm storing it in local storage. So when I create the store, it looks in local storage, and it says like, hey, is there anything in called redux state in local storage? And if there is, I'm going to pull it off, and this will be my initial state. If there's not, then I'll just use the initial state. And then then it creates it, and then every redux store has a method called subscribe, and so every single time, this is what happens internally when you use connect in Redux or React Redux, is it does it subscribes to, so every single time the Redux store changes, it will fire changes on your component. So we can just describe, and then every single time there's a change, it just persists this into local storage. So now I have this re-render method, and now it will always re-render with the providers. And then I'm explicitly creating a new store each time because that is what's happening. When the page refreshes, like it's just going to rerun your app.js file, and it's going to recreate your store. So I want it to be as if I am the user. So one bug that I ran into was I didn't create a wrapper around, or I did create the wrapper around the provider, but I didn't create a new store. But since the store was already in memory, it just worked automatically. And I was like, this doesn't make sense because I got rid of the persisting and it was still working. It was because the store was like still saved in memory, like with the persisted values. So I was like, okay, well I want to be as close as possible to like what the user's using it. So I needed to make sure that every single time I re-render, I'm actually like creating an entirely new store. And it's looking at local storage again. Okay, so now when I simulate a page refresh, I unmount, I re-render, and I check to see like, hey, the button, it has that style, the new color. So now I know when I refresh the page, it has the new style there. Okay, so lastly, so I said I would talk about writing tests that stand the test of time. So I think if you can confidently say that the more your tests resemble like the way your software is used, the more confidence they can give you. So if you're writing your tests in that regard, then your tests will be able to stand the test of time, and it won't give you headaches because every single time you make a change, like it won't break your tests. With that, thank you.